church is there is a truth that just being part of a local congregation doesn't make you saved, right? You can attend a local meeting of the church, and that doesn't mean you have been justified, that you have been united to Christ. And so the visible church is a visible expression of the invisible truth about Christians being united to Jesus. But that visibility is not a one-to-one correlation, which means that sometimes the visible church is a little bit more obscured. Sometimes in our sin, the human corporate gatherings of God's people make mistakes or err or depart from the truth, and it becomes less clear how the visible gathering is actually associated with the gospel of Christ. And so what the confession does is it identifies three things that are kind of litmus tests for how clearly the visible church corresponds to the invisible church. The teaching of the gospel and it being embraced, the administration of ordinances, so that means the Lord's Supper, baptism, it means worship on the Lord's Day, and then public worship. Are we actually worshiping God as he intends, or are we deviating from his will?
Oh, smart. I like that. Now, you raise a question in your article. Does God's worship, word, and sacraments belong to Christians as individuals or as individuals gathered together, or do they belong to something more formal and institutional?
Yeah. So the article that I wrote is really just trying to answer that question. So I think of my friend, the college student, and that experience and that interaction. I think of other similar experiences. So another example would be I had some friends that decided to go on a camping retreat, and they were all Christians, very, very faithful people. And at the end of it, all of them from very different backgrounds just decided that they were going to have the Lord's Supper together. They got together and somebody went through the words of institution and distributed elements of bread and drink. And so the question is it appropriate for those Christians as just multiple Christians gathered together to have the sacrament like that? So there's a range in possibility. Can you do something as an individual? Can you do something as a group of people? Or is there something more institutional that's required for the worship of the church? And the way I try to go about answering this in the article is to focus on the government of the church, which for a non-Christian can kind of seem like a weird phrase. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that the Bible shows throughout the New Testament is that God has established leaders, officers of the church to guide and oversee it on his behalf. And one of the implications of that is that while the church is not defined by its officers, what it means is that under normal circumstances, those officers are required for the gathering of the church to actually be the gathering of the church. So part of what I conclude in the article is that church is the thing to which the worship, word, and sacraments belong, even though individual Christians may still worship God on their own or read the Bible on their own.
All right. That's a pretty good answer.
Yeah. So part of the reason I wrote the article in the first place is because my experience with a college student and these other friends, I don't think is a particularly unusual thing. In our cultural moment, it's very fashionable to say things like, you don't go to church, you are the church, or we got to go out and be the church. And I think one of the effects of this over the past 45 to 50 years has been that church attendance is down, but not just that people's actual knowledge of Scripture and following Jesus has been negatively affected. And so kind of what I was striking while I didn't bring it up was a bit of a contrary tone to assert that, well, no, actually, church is something you have to attend to. Even in our reformed world right now is not the most prevalent opinion.
Right, because you get a lot of people that they don't like the word institutional. They don't like the word government. Mm-hmm. I mean, because if you look at Presbyterianism, it's a form of government. Some people don't understand it, don't like it. They think it's too much, too little. It all depends on how the person feels, and I think that's the dangerous part too. You know, a group of kids getting together, administering the Lord's Supper. I know for a fact in the Presbyterian faith, especially in the EPC and the PCA for sure, I know they guard the table and they don't just let anybody in there and take the Lord's Supper if they haven't confessed of their sins and, cleanse themselves before and eating and drinking.
Right. So the question behind that is who has the obligation or the responsibility to guard the Lord's table? Is it the church as a whole? Is it individual Christians, or is it the officers of the church? And what I argue is that it's the officers of the church, and by implication that means that church has to be more institutional than just people gathering together.
Right, and we see that in a lot of these mega churches that do TV evangelists, and all they're doing is trying to get money.
No, so it's really easy to talk about this and think institutional legalism or ritualism or something very impersonal. But one of the implications of officers, leaders of the church, elders, pastors, being involved in overseeing it is it requires them to be personally involved in the lives of their congregants. Yep. And so there's actually a more personal, nurturing, shepherding aspect to the church as a result of this. When you have people that are gathering together on their own without people called to this ministry or who are qualified to lead, in one sense you have sheep without a shepherd, and that can be a very dangerous thing and an unhealthy thing.
Oh, that was good. I like that. Okay, so my roommate and I, we grapple, and we kind of entered this before, but I want to go into more detail so he can listen to this after we're done. But my roommate and I, we grapple with Christians going to church or to a building and being the church. We both agree that individually we are the church, but if we proclaim that Jesus is Lord and Savior, then we can be called the church. Now, are Christians the church, or do Christians go to church, or is it both?
Well, I think the answer to that is a little bit of both, but mostly Christians go to church. So the word church, just etymologically, the definition of it in Greek, ekklesia, is gathering of people. And so that requires that church on some level be a gathering. So you have to attend gatherings. That only really moves the question back one step, but regardless, what that means is that people have to attend to the church. And
again, and that goes back to what I said about the fellowship, fellowshipping with like-minded believers.
Right. So I think a good illustration of this is one used by Paul in 1 Corinthians. Is your finger the body, or is it part of the body? And the answer is you can't call the finger or your foot or your nose the body, but it is part of the body. But even that really pushes the question back, because I could just say that Christians in their totality are the church rather than go to church. But I think the language that we see throughout the New Testament is that church is a location, an assembly that people attend to. So, for instance, in 1 Timothy 3, Paul says this: "If I delay, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God," which is the church of the living God. So when he talks about in the household of God right there, he's talking about the church as a location, something to which Timothy attended. We see language like that throughout the rest of the New Testament as well. So in 1 Corinthians 14:19, Paul says, "Nevertheless, in church, I'd rather speak 5 words with my mind in order to instruct others." So Paul in 1 Corinthians 14 is discussing in the gathering of God's people, how should we behave? How should we conduct ourselves? And he refers to that as the church in the gathering. So I think one of the things is that Christians are components of the church. They are necessary for the church to exist. Without Christians, there would be no gathering. There would be no place of worship. But that is not the definition of the church. The definition of the church is the gathering where the gospel is proclaimed, where the ordinances are administered, where the worship of God is conducted.
Yeah, one of the things that I told him was it's important that we do go to church, and his biggest thing was, well, why do we have to go to a building? Why do we idolize a building? And I'm like, well, we don't idolize a building. It's our temple, if you will, that we consecrated or we set apart for the gathering of God's people. I don't know. I think I may have mucked it up when I gave him that response.
No, I think there's a lot of people who feel similarly that there's been a mistake of equating the gathering of God's people with the building. And I don't have a problem referring to the building as a church. It's just describing the building by what it's used for. But I think you're absolutely right. The building is the space that has been consecrated for this purpose. So if a congregation decided to meet in their parking lot or in the lot next door, or to have a worship service that wasn't in their building but some other location, I mean, that's very much still the church, whether or not that the normal building is being used.
Gotcha. And that might answer the next question. Why is the church a visible institution?
And so that obviously means more than why is it a building, because the church is not a building. And I think this gets back to what I was saying earlier about the resurrection. God, when he redeems creation through the death and resurrection of Christ, is redeeming his original purpose, that he would make a people for himself to glorify him, to find joy in him. And so that requires in earth now, as we await with longing the return of Christ, that the creation that's being redeemed, the people who have been called out to follow Jesus, to actually gather together. Earth was created physical. People were created physical, and that when you gather together is a physical, visible thing. And that's why the church has to be a visible institution rather than just a state of mind or something that a set of philosophies that we all agree on, because we are reflecting God's original created purpose in gathering and calling out a people for himself.
Yeah, and that would make it, I would ask this question if I'm asked again, why do we need a building? Why does the Super Bowl or the football teams need stadiums? I think that just answered my own question.
Yeah, and part of the thing with the building is I'm a fan of buildings. I work in one as far as the church goes, but the early church didn't have buildings. They gathered in people's homes. And that was more of lack of resources as they were young and under persecution. But there's nothing that necessitates a particular building.
Right. The room I'm sitting in right now, it's big enough to where I can have at least 20 to 30 people, and I can say that is the church, within my own house. So, yeah, I agree with you.
Even the language that he uses in 1 Timothy 3, when he identifies the household of God as the church, the implication seems to be that the church was gathering in someone's house. It wasn't Paul just using very familial language like, hey, we're all family together. But the reason he could use that was because the people in Ephesus were gathering together in someone's house.
Right. And like you said, it's because they were under-resourced and didn't have, I guess, the funds or the means to build a separate building. I mean, during that time, you had the Jews that had temples, and they consecrated a temple, for the living God.
Now, I've spent some time overseas in some areas where people are either persecuted or don't have resources as Christians. And I know it's a huge deal whenever they actually get their own building, because it feels like they actually have a place for them, especially in places like India, where you see Hindu temples all over the place. To have a location that says this is dedicated for the worship of the God of the Bible is a huge deal. It's not necessary for the Christian faith. They could still gather in people's homes or in other locations, but it's symbolic of here's a place dedicated, as you said, consecrated to the worship of God.
Right. Oh, that's good. Okay. Now, this also came up last night. My roommate and I, we have a lot of theological debates. He's Lutheran, Presbyterian, so that ought to be fun. But I want to discuss God's sovereign election. And this points back to the Westminster Confession of Faith, again, chapter 25.1, and I'm going to read it to you. And then we're going to look at the larger catechism, questions 64 to 66. We may not go over all of them. 25.1 says the Catholic or universal church is visible and consists of all of the elect who have been or who will ever be gathered into one under Christ, the head. The church is his body and espouse the fullness of God who fills all in all. Okay, so let me turn over to question 64 of the larger catechism.
I've got it pulled up. It says the invisible church is the whole number of the elect that have been, are, or shall be gathered into one under Christ the head.
Okay. In your definition, after reading that, what would be your answer before we read the actual answer?
What answer the question? What is the invisible church?
Yes.
I would probably say something very similar to that. So when people ask me to create a statement of faith, I always get annoyed because I rather just give them the Westminster Confession and Catechisms, because that is my statement of faith. And so I don't know if I would be able to say something different. But the invisible church is the body of the composition of all people who have ever been joined to Christ, past, present, future. And the visible church, the physical gathering, is a testament to this invisible union, and looking forward to when the invisible and the